Brilliant. Well, welcome everyone. This is an event that is sponsored by Labour Unions, which is the collective group of unions that are part of the Labour Party. We've got a really exciting panel here today, and we've got a really exciting topic as well, which I think has probably given more impetus over the behaviour of the Tories recently, which I'm sure that our panellists will be keen to talk about. So the running order for tonight is that we've got about an hour, and we're going to invite the panellists to make their contributions, and then we'll be open to a Q&A. And of course, the focus again is on the Tories and the government's election bill, and how do we stop it? What strategies can we look to develop to hinder it? And what's the best way to build public support? And we've got a diverse group of speakers that represent our elected parliamentarians, such as Kat Smith, who is the Shadow Secretary for State and for Young People and Democracy. Welcome, Kat. Also joined as well by Nick Lowles, who is the Chief Executive of Hope Not Hate from the charitable sector, and Helen Pearce, who is the Director of Labour Unions. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Kat, who can maybe tell us a bit about what Parliament's doing and how we can link up with those efforts. Kat.
Thanks, Hazel. So I'm the Shadow Cabinet Lead on the Elections Bill. So I've been with the bill sort of since second reading and through committee. So my contribution, Hazel, is going to be a sort of overview of what's in the bill. So I know where the panellists are going to go into the specifics of the implications for the Labour movement. So anyone who's been following the press coverage of this bill probably have noticed that the main thing that's grabbing the imagination, certainly of the media and of commentariat, is around the provisions in the bill to require voters to show photo ID at polling stations. I think it's quite clear that there is obviously internationally a variation between what kind of documentation an elector has to show at a polling station. But in countries that do require photo ID cards to vote, tend to have almost all have a national ID card. And obviously here in the UK, we don't have a national ID card. So therefore, access to identity documents is varied in terms of what ID people have. And certainly as a member of Parliament, one of the things that quickly becomes quite obvious is that for a lot of people, proving their identity is a huge issue. Some groups will be disproportionately impacted by this, because if the bill goes through in its current form, the forms of ID that are valid are very restrictive and quite political. I'd say that it's been taken directly from the Trumpian playbook in the US, where Republican states use the ID requirements to suppress a anti-Republican vote. And we can see that pulled over across the pond and applied here in a UK context. So the fact that, a gun license would be valid ID, but a student ID won't, has political implications in terms of the types of voters who find it easy to prove identity and not. There are a lot of organisations that campaign on race equality have been very clear that the racial inequalities of access to ID means that for Black and minority ethnic voters, this will be an additional barrier to participation at elections. And frankly, the best way we can strengthen our democracy, and that any democracy can strengthen its integrity, is to increase participation. If there are bad actors trying to commit electoral fraud, it's far harder for them to commit electoral fraud when there is a high turnout. It's low turnout elections which are easier for bad actors to manipulate. So the requirement to show ID will only serve to drive down turnout, and therefore actually puts the integrity of our elections at risk as a policy. So it does the complete opposite of what the Conservative government argue that it will do. Now, this ID requirement has certainly captured the imagination of the commentariat, and I suspect that a lot of people have read about various columns in newspapers around this ID requirement. I'm going to argue that this isn't the worst part of the bill. I think this is the bit of the bill that people can easily understand, and people can understand whether or not, if you think about your grandma, whether or not she's got a passport and driving license, and whether or not she's going to be able to vote. But the actual, I'd say, the much more sinister parts of the bill are around things like the politicisation of the Electoral Commission. So the Electoral Commission is an independent body that regulates political parties, and the governing party in the United Kingdom is the Conservative Party. Now, as well as being the government, they are also a political party. The Electoral Commission is going to, if this bill passes, is going to be given a strategy and policy document by the government, written by the government, that tells the Electoral Commission what its priorities should be. Now, I think this is a threat to the independence of the Electoral Commission and needs to be seen in light of some of the other attempts to politically interfere with other bodies. And you can pick up any particular body and see this. Now, the government are arguing that a strategy and policy document for an independent regulator is not unusual for the government to give them that. For instance, things like Ofwat, that's something that currently happens. But when it comes to regulating elections, it is different, and it should be seen as different. Currently, the way the Electoral Commission is held to account in democratic structures is that the speakers of the House of Commons have a Speakers Committee on the Electoral Commission. I'm actually one of the 3 opposition MPs who sits on that commission, but there are 7 Conservative MPs on that committee. Now, we already have a built-in government majority on that committee, and this bill seeks to strengthen that government majority. And as someone who has sat through countless meetings of the Speakers Committee on the Electoral Commission, I know fine well that if anything gets pushed to a vote, myself, the other Labour MP and the SNP MP are not going to be able to stop the Conservatives all voting en bloc to basically already push around the Electoral Commission. So I think there are things that can be done to strengthen the Electoral Commission. For instance, not having one party have a majority on the Speakers Committee would have been a good change that we could do in the elections bill that would strengthen it. There are also provisions in the bill around voting for blind and partially sighted voters. So currently the law states that if you are a blind or partially sighted voter, you should be entitled to use a tactile voting device. Now, these are less than ideal. It's like a grid that you can put on top of the ballot paper, and you can know that for instance, the Labour Party candidate is the 3rd candidate on the ballot, so you can read Braille and or count down, and you can put a cross in the right box, so you can vote independently and in secret. Now, it's a bit clunky, it's a bit old-fashioned, and I'm sure that technology means that we can improve things. But by removing the baseline and saying that local authorities can decide what's appropriate, it creates a postcode lottery for blind and partially sighted voters. The RNIB is campaigning against these changes, and when that amendment was debated in committee and was defeated by the Conservative majority on that committee, the minister was asked to set out the reasons why she was opposing it, and she chose not to, which shows huge disrespect to the RNIB, but also the many concerned people that actually wrote in. So it's strange as an MP to actually receive correspondence from constituents on amendments in bill committee. That's not normal. So it was quite outstanding that was something that people were in touch about. The other thing is that after the second reading, the government did a parliamentary manoeuvre, which meant they changed the bill before it went into committee to change the voting systems for mayoral elections in England and police and crime commissioner elections in England and Wales, which are currently held under a supplementary vote system. And the government have decided to amend the bill to make these elections happen under first past the post. But again, it's another party political move, because there are several mayoral elections where if it had been held under first past the post, a Conservative would have been elected, but because it was held under the supplementary vote system, a non-Conservative mayor was elected. So again, it is the government basically picking the system that benefits the Conservative Party. And frankly, it's no way to go about constitutional matters. When it comes to constitutional matters, it is right for any government of any colour to seek cross-party consensus. And I'm sure that cross-party consensus can be found on many of these issues. There are many ways in which we can improve our electoral law, which is 200 years old and across many different acts, and is completely foggy mess of different pieces of legislation. I'm sure there is a possibility that we can find this cross-party consensus, but there has been no attempt by the government to reach out and to do this. And I suppose that's what's really disappointing. And finally, conscious of time, the malicious bit of the bill, which is not going to be covered by the other speakers, is probably to do with foreign donations. So at the moment, if you leave the UK, you can be a UK elector for another 15 years, voting in the last parliamentary constituency that you lived in. Now, the government want to abolish the 15 years, and so that you can forevermore be an elector. I don't particularly have an issue with people casting votes, but what I do have an issue with is that when you are a UK elector, you're also a permissible donor, and you can donate to political parties. Again, it's another very thought-through move by the Conservative Party to bring many of their donors that currently live overseas and have done for over 15 years, give them permission to donate to political parties. If the government was playing with a straight bat, they would say they wanted to remove the 15-year limit, but remove the right for people not living in the UK to donate to UK political parties. And given that the minister admitted in committee that she's never read the Russia report, and I don't believe she understands the threats to UK democracy, I do worry that the government hasn't properly fully thought through any of this stuff, and instead are just looking at how they can benefit the Conservative Party. And I know the other speakers are going to talk about how this bill impacts the Labour Party's relationship with trade unions, but just to say from a Labour frontbench point of view, I'm really proud to work with our trade union colleagues right across the Labour movement, and Helen's been an absolute font of knowledge and a real big help in this bill. And I'm really pleased that we're doing this meeting tonight, because the implications of the elections bill have implications for political parties, obviously, electors definitely, but it also has huge implications for the campaign that the trade union movement does. And the trade union movement is also a political voice of working people in this country. So frankly, the bill is an attack on working people in this country, and I'm really pleased that we can work together on this and hopefully campaign and make some wins. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thanks, Kat. Just remind people, if people want to ask questions, there is a Q&A box, and you can start to put those questions in now if you like, and we'll come to them when we come to the Q&A. So Nick, basically what I've heard from Kat is that you know, massive like millionaire donors who live abroad are okay to be involved in the political process now, but NGOs and trade unions maybe not so much, which is a interesting way of increasing democracy in the country. What's your take from your point of view?
Sure. Thanks for inviting me to speak. I mean, I think that I want to talk about how this bill will impact on third-party campaigning generally, and how it will impact on Hope Not Hate specifically. And then I want to kind of spend a couple of minutes just saying what I think that some of the what we should be doing to go forward. I mean, I think that my three big takeaways, it undermines democracy. It further removes people from the democratic process and reduces accountability. And in a period of mistrust and disinformation, I think that will only have a really negative impact in society. And I think the consequence of this bill, if it goes through, it will dissuade campaign groups from engaging in the political process. And again, that's bad for democracy. I think, this comes after the Lobbying Act a few years ago, 2014 Lobbying Act, which in a way, I think that silenced a lot of national campaign groups. I mean, very few national campaign groups get involved in elections now, not because they can't, just because the loopholes you have to go through, the paperwork you have to fill out, the regulations, the reporting actually makes it really difficult. And actually big organisations with hundreds of staff don't bother to do it. I think what this bill does is not only tighten that even further and put even further constraints on national organisations, but it really impacts local organisations as well and local campaigns. And I think that, what is healthy in democracy is not just what happens at a national level, it's locally. If you're upset about what your MP is doing or a political party is doing, or feel really strongly on a planning issue or a housing issue or a health issue, your ability to engage in that political process could become a lot more difficult. And I think the consequence of that, where local action groups, local campaign groups, local residents groups, who don't have access to lawyers, don't have access to kind of regulators to keep check on reporting, will actually stop campaigning, and I think that would be massive. I mean, for us, I think that there's some really worrying language about joint campaigning. And I think that not only around elections, but the way that the bill is being drafted, it could impact on joint campaigning that Hope No Hate does, for example, with a political party, any political party, in the 365 days before an election. Now, obviously, by removing the Fixed Term Parliament Act, we don't know when an election is going to be, and that will have a big impact on our work. I think, you know, one of the kind of really worrying parts of it is Section 23, which gives the Secretary of State huge powers and discretionary powers to determine who is a campaigner, who's allowed to participate in an election, and at what level they're allowed to participate in an election. And I think that this is just the latest government bill, which A, gives Secretary of State a huge amount of power, but B, it's written in a way that we don't know the real implications of this bill, because the Secretary of State can determine what the rules are after the bill becomes an act. And so actually, you know, that's, I think, really one of the really worrying elements. Kat talked about the Electoral Commission, and obviously this reduces the power of the Electoral Commission, it reduces their power of oversight and taking action against political parties, which of course, you know, you wonder why that the government is keen to do that at the moment. But of course the consequences are it reduces oversight, it reduces accountability. And so it means that political parties who are already extremely powerful, and particularly this government, which seems to ignore all sorts of rules, will be freer to do whatever it wants, whereas campaign groups and smaller third parties have even tighter rules. And you know, the real impact on small organisations, it reduces the threshold. At the moment, you have to spend over £20,000 before you have to do reporting to the Electoral Commission. It brings that down, and potentially it brings it down to £700, where you start kicking in with the Electoral Commission process. For a small action group who are active in only one parliamentary constituency or whatever, suddenly £700 isn't a huge amount of money. And then to go through all the reporting process, I just think will push a lot of small organisations out. So, you know, I think that this will have a huge detrimental impact on third-party campaigners, campaign groups, NGOs, action groups from engaging in the political process, which can only be bad for politics. In terms of what we should do, I mean, of course, there is the reality of the parliamentary arithmetic at the moment, you know, and the reality is, I think that the best chance we have is in the House of Lords, and for that we obviously need to engage crossbenchers and even some Tories. But I think that the mood, particularly because of what's happened in the last couple of weeks, means that people are more open to this now. I think that we need to frame this bill in the wider context. You know, the bill is bad in its own right, but, you know, you frame it because of what's happened with the Lobbying Act, you frame it with the Police and Crime Bill, the Immigration and Nationalities Bill, the changes to the Official Secrets Act, all designed to limit the ability of people to protest. It ties up journalists. It kind of criminalizes kind of whistleblowers who are exposing wrongdoing. On top of that, we've got the kind of the government attempts to kind of politically dominate and influence the BBC, the disgraceful behaviour around Ofcom and getting Paul Dacre in charge of Ofcom. So and with all the lobbying now. So I mean, I think it's important that we frame this in a wider context. This is about democracy. This is another stage to undermine democracy. And I think we need to make the moral case for that, as well as the specifics of the bill. And I think within that context, I do think that there are crossbenchers and even some Tories who are getting worried about this government, the Boris Johnson government, riding coach and horses through our rights as individuals, our society, our rules, and you know, our democratic norms. And I think that, you know, what's important is to build a coalition outside of Parliament. One of the things that worries me is that too few organisations are worried about this bill now. This will have huge impact, partly because people are busy on other things, but also people think that we can't win. and or people are just focusing on the voter ID stuff or trying to use it as a platform to get kind of proportional representation. So, you know, I think it's important we focus on the bill, build it into the wider context of an attack on democracy.
Thanks, Nick. Helen, I mean, it doesn't sound too bad so far. I don't know why we're all moaning. So why should working people, specifically involved in the trade unions, be concerned about this? If we didn't have cause for concern already from the last two speakers.
Thanks, Hazel, and thanks, Kat and Nick, for those contributions. I think they were a really important context to the bill. I'm going to talk about some of the more specific elements, sort of picking up on what Nick was saying about the joint third-party campaigning element of the bill. And I think one of the problems with this bill is that there's just so much in it that the volume of stuff is hard to get across to campaigners, and it's also really complex and complicated and convoluted, and we're talking about things that might happen if this and this, and it's very technical. So I just want to go through in a bit of detail a little bit about what this could mean for affiliated trade unions specifically, because I think the implications could be really quite chilling. And also just to talk a little bit more about what we've been talking about in the context of the last few weeks. And I think this sense in society that we can't let the government get away with marking their own homework and setting the rules of the game anymore, because I do think that some of the news that's come out in recent weeks changes the context that we're debating, and it's really important for us to make sure that we are responding to this. So I'm just going to run through a little bit about both of those things. And I think this point about marking their own homework is really important, because it is a theme for the Tories at this stage, isn't it? We've seen it again and again. They don't like the rules, so they either change the rules, they put themselves in charge of deciding what those rules are, who has broken them, and what the sanctions are. And that is precisely what they are doing with the elections bill. They're marking their own homework by giving more power over election campaigning and the commission to ministers. And at the moment, obviously, those are Tory ministers that belong to the governing party. There's also another theme that I think the Tories have been fond of, throughout the last 100 years, but in particular since 2010, and that is new restrictions to silence the trade union movement, and specifically the sort of political element of the trade union movement and where the union movement meets politics and the Labour Party. So they've thrown in some measures on that as well. And it's just critically important that we fight to preserve the hard-won democratic rights for unions, for society, for future generations, and to just not let them get away with playing these games and determining the rules of politics in their own interest. I won't go through all of the bill, but I'm going to concentrate specifically on where these two tactics come together, the combination of the new restrictions that risk silencing Labour affiliated unions and this land grab over the rules of the game that ministers are making. And it's important to put this in the context of the last 10 years. This is the third attack on the political voice of trade unions that we have seen since the Tories entered government in 2010. We've had the Gagging Act, the Lobbying Act of 2014, and the Trade Union Act prior to this. And it's clear exactly what they are up to, because they have done it again and again and again in really what is quite a short space of time. We've seen the rules completely changed under our feet. What is at risk here for trade unions, for affiliated trade unions, and therefore for the working people that they represent, is trade unions' right to campaign independently, separately from the Labour Party. I'm going to explain a bit about how this works, because I think it's important that we all try and get our heads around the technicalities of it. So back in 2014, the Lobbying Act introduced new restrictions on what are called non-party campaigners. So charities, trade unions, other civil society organisations, when they were campaigning in coalition together. So at the moment, under the Lobbying Act rules, if trade unions or charities run a joint campaign in the year running up to a general election, then each of those organisations has to record and declare the total expenditure of the joint campaign against their own individual spending limits. So the money has only been spent once, but it has to be declared multiple times over. So obviously the bigger the coalition, the more each organisation is having to declare, and eating into each organisation's own individual limits. So as a hypothetical example, if you've got 20 organisations working together, each of them spends £10,000, which is a drop in the ocean compared to the 390,000 that technically they're allowed to spend nationally. Each organisation would have to declare that they had effectively spent £200,000. So £10,000 spent by an organisation, but each organisation having to declare £200,000 and using up half of their theoretical limit of 390,000, even though they had not actually spent that money. Well, I've got a principled opposition to these joint campaigning rules, because personally I believe that working together in coalition is a good thing. I believe in free speech. I think that it is positive that organisations can band together to campaign, and that each individual organisation's limits should be declared separately. I mean, we believe in movements in the Labour Party. We believe in working together. But those changes came in 2014, and we've seen those effects as now organisations across the third sector tend to be much more cautious and prudent about doing joint campaigning in case an election is called and they all end up collectively liable for everybody's expenditure. I mean, this is the chilling effect that we talk about, of people not doing things in case they accidentally end up breaking the law, even though they might have actually been able to find a way to do them under the rules. So scaring people out of taking action. But this new bill tweaks this joint campaign rule and strengthens it effectively. So now it's not just third-party, non-party organisations campaigning jointly who would be collectively liable for joint campaign expenditure. They are including political parties in that definition. And obviously this is going to have a different effect for a political party that has strong historic links with external organisations that happen to be non-party campaigners, and it will affect that party and those organisations in a very different and disproportionate way to parties that don't have those structures. And obviously it's quite clear when you look at the Labour Party and our link with the affiliated unions, but also with all the socialist societies as well, that there are links there that are going to be complicated and affected by these new rules. But a lot of the risk here comes down to what we've been talking about with this land grab by ministers as well, because a huge part of how this plays out will be deciding how joint campaigning is defined, and whether there is a risk that what we all think of at the moment to be clearly Labour Party campaigning ends up falling foul of those rules and being redefined as joint campaign expenditure, therefore making unions or socialist societies liable for everything the party has spent on a particular campaign and eating up their own expenditure limits before they have spent a penny of money independently as separate organisations. Now, this isn't a threat to the Labour Party's campaigning. The party's election spend limits will stay the same as they are at the moment, and they're already required to declare any expenditure on vote Labour leaflets that any trade union already produces. So it doesn't actually affect the Labour Party. The organisation that it could potentially affect are those who are clearly linked to the party, but who also campaign in their own right as independent entities. So what is at risk is the right of the affiliated unions to campaign in their own voice on the issues and priorities that matter to their members and to the 4 million working people and their families that those organisations represent. And that could be industrial political campaigns in the 12 months before an election. It could be their own spin on why a vote for Labour matters, with messaging and priorities that are different and distinct from the party's voice. And it's not just about the Labour Party as well, because if a union's allowance for spending on campaigning for or against political parties is reduced or even obliterated by Labour Party spending that has been redefined as joint spending, then there is no space left in those unions' allowances for campaigns against voting for far-right parties and candidates at election time as well. And again, this just brings us straight back to this issue of ministerial control, because this issue is wrong in and of itself. I mean, it's just ludicrous to try and group together and regulate political parties that are national political organisations that can spend £20 million in the year before an election, and civil society organisations that are not set up on anything like the same scale, that for whom campaigning at election time is not the reason that they exist. So trying to group these together is illogical. I mean, the idea that you would try and divvy up the sort of £390,000 allowance between all of the affiliated unions and the Labour Party, so suddenly each organisation is ineffectively able to spend in the tens of thousands rather than £390,000 is clearly something that is going to stop people campaigning and stop people advocating votes for Labour. But what is really ridiculous is that the government are giving themselves the right to write the rules about what counts as joint campaigning. Unions are represented at every level of the Labour Party, and we all know, because they do it every time, the Tories will be trying to claim that the legitimate constitutional business of our party means that this campaign or that campaign that is run by the party is effectively joint with the affiliated unions, and suddenly everybody is liable for it. And by giving themselves the right to direct the Commission, they're not only making sure that the playing field is tilted in their favour, they're giving themselves the right to referee the game at the same time. And the retrospective nature of this I think is really key. I mean, Nick was talking about the Fixed Term Parliament Act. Election spending is regulated for those 12 months leading up to a general election, and it counts even if the election is only known about 5 weeks before it happens. So all of that campaign expenditure for the 12 months preceding it has to count, even though nobody would necessarily have known an election was coming. And by giving themselves the right to direct the Commission, the government could even be rewriting the rules halfway through an election campaign, or right up until a few weeks out from an election as well. I mean, this isn't how we do politics in the UK. Historically, we have regulated politics by consensus, not by writing rules that disproportionately affect one party or one side without their consent. There's a huge freedom of speech issue here, and I think issues around freedom of association, the right of unions to have an independent political voice separate from the Labour Party, and also the right of the party and the unions to order their constitutional business without undue interference from the state, or having been deemed to have broken the law just by doing politics in the Labour Party the way that we choose to do it. This comes on the back of switching the political levy to an opt-in, and all of the things that they have done over years and generations to try and silence trade unions. The right of unions to an independent voice, political voice, is under threat yet again. These rules are unnecessary. I mean, we say it all of the time, but it cannot be said enough. I think trade union campaigning is the cleanest money in politics. It is so well regulated by the Electoral Commission, the certification officer, unions' own democratic structures. There's the rules I've talked about, so that if a campaign is overtly pro-Labour, it already counts towards the Labour Party spending limits. Union members get to decide how how unions do politics and the priorities of the union. This isn't about fairness, it's about rigging the rules. It's clear that we cannot trust this government to set the rules of the game, and certainly not to proceed in a way that is clearly marking their own homework and getting to decide who has broken the rules and who hasn't. It's not how we do business, and we have to demand better of this government, even if they consistently and clearly deliberately fail to meet those basic standards that we would expect of them. It's a really important campaign. It is not going to be an easy win. I think that is very, very clear from the sort of parliamentary arithmetic that Nick has alluded to, but making sure that we understand what is at stake here, and that we are trying to build a movement and a clear sort of set of messages that this is just not how we do things in this country. It is not fair. It is outside the political norms. I think is really crucial, and I think building this up over the coming weeks as this moves into the House of Lords and we have an opportunity to make some of these basic fairness and decency arguments, I think is really important. So thank you all for coming along today, and I'm yeah, looking forward to getting stuck into this over the next few weeks and months.
Brilliant, thanks, Helen. So I'm going to move to some questions, and I'm going to take them in reverse order of reverse speaking order. So the first question that we have is from Jackie Jones, and she said, does this have any implications for devolution, especially Wales? So I'll take an answer response from Helen, and then Nick, and then Kat, in that order.
Around devolution, I'm going to pass this one over to Kat, if that's all right. Sorry.
That's fine. I'm happy to.
Outside my expertise.
Yeah, so the bill obviously has implications across the United Kingdom. So there is a requirement for legislative consent motions to be passed by the Senedd Cymru and for the Scottish Parliament. Both in Scotland and Wales, we've had indications from the Labour government in Cardiff Bay and the government in Scotland that they would deny those legislative consent motions, which obviously creates, you know, a tension that's unnecessary. And it is the Conservative government provoking arguments in ways which are unnecessary. I know far more about the situation in Wales than Scotland, but certainly the Welsh Labour government is looking to bring in its own elections bill in a couple of years' time, and the work for that is already underway. There's already been quite a lot of changes, for instance, extending the franchise to 16 and 17-year-olds. So it feels a little bit like the government, the Conservative government in Westminster is just provoking the Labour government in Wales unnecessarily, and my colleagues in the Senedd Cymru are obviously in conversations with the Cabinet Office. So it's not the Cabinet Office anymore, I apologise. They moved the bill from Cabinet Office to the Department for Levelling Up Communities and Housing. I think that's what it's called anyway. Michael Gove. It's all Michael Gove's fault.
Nick, did you want to add anything to that? Nope, that's fine. Most things tend to be Michael Gove's fault. But maybe he thought them up in a really tragic disco in Aberdeen, where he's frequently spotted. So our next question, just to remind everyone, if you're posting questions in the chat, I might miss them. So there is a difference between the chat function and the Q&A function. So if you could just pop your question over into the Q&A, I'll ensure that I'll try to keep an eye on both, but it's just a lot easier if it's all in one place. So next question is, can I have a clear roadmap on how we stop the elections bill? So there's obviously different ways and different organisations that are campaigning on this. So I think, what's the one ask or action that someone listening in tonight could maybe do to try and stop this? So we'll start with Helen, then Kat, and then Nick.
Thanks, Hazel. I think this is the challenge, isn't it? How do we stop this? And I think that we need to be honest that this is going to be very difficult. It's clear that there's the nature of Parliament is that the Tories have a majority in the House of Commons. The numbers and the arithmetic in the House of Lords are more complicated, but not straightforwardly helpful to us. Winning on this is probably not going to look like beating back the whole bill. I think winning on this is probably going to look like finding areas of it that we can improve and that we can limit the damage of. And then ultimately, as unfortunately with all of these things, it is about going out there and winning a Labour government in order that we can repeal it and build something better, and that is a positive vision of how democracy in our country should run. And I think that we need to probably be honest with ourselves about the fact that this is going to be challenging. Having said that, I think that there really is a strong case that we can make in the House of Lords, working with our Labour colleagues there, but specifically to reach out to crossbenchers, to some of the Tories, to people with a range of sort of political backgrounds, to just make it clear that this is outside the norms of how we do politics in this country. And I think that in some ways possibly we're helped by the fact that the last few weeks and the way that the Tories have been behaving, and the fact that there seems to be a sense in society that actually having structures in place that adjudicate systems fairly, that are impartial, and that are not the people who are in power taking more power for themselves, is important. And I think putting this in the context of that, particularly around the issue of the ministerial power grab, I think is going to be really important. I don't think there is a straightforward action for activists in terms of the House of Lords, because it's not as simple as let's all sign up to a petition and people will come on board, or email your MP and so on. I think it is about going in and making very tailored, targeted arguments on some of these issues. But I do think that there is a strong case to be made. And I think within the movement, I think some of this is about us talking to other colleagues in the movement, just to make sure that people understand the implications of this, and that we are getting people talking about this and interested in it, and trying to get as much of a buzz as we can about an issue that is technical and difficult and coming amongst so much other noise at the moment, to be honest with you, because I think the more mood music we can get going outside the House of Lords about the unfairness of this, and the fact that this is beyond what the normal bounds of how governments operate, the more that will help us to make some of those arguments internally. But I think we also do need to be, to some extent, looking beyond this, because some elements of this we are not going to win every battle, and we need to be thinking about what would a Labour government do to not only repeal but also replace with better and more positive legislation that is genuinely about making our society more democratic.
Thanks, Helen. Kat?
I agree with absolutely everything that Helen says, and as someone who believes in democracy, relying on an elected House of Lords to try and fix a bill and make it more democratic, I've got to be honest, the irony is not lost on me, but we have to work in the system that we've got. In terms of timetable, because I have picked up on the chat that there was a question in there about what timetable the bill is likely to take, and I think by answering that, I think it answers some of the previous question as well, which is that I think that I am more optimistic today than I have been at any point since this bill was published, that we will be able to get some pushback, and we will be able to get some concessions, and that's because of the wider political fallout of the Owen Paterson affairs of, you know, MPs basically voting to overrule their own homework. And I think what's really clear is the government's on the back foot now. They were planning to bring the elections bill back to the House of Commons for its report stage, which is the next stage it would reach in the Commons process soon, and it's gone very quiet. I suspect because the government don't particularly want 650 MPs to have the opportunity to debate this bill on the floor of the House of Commons, because there's an awful lot of us who will stand up in that chamber and point out the way that this has been done is completely out of kilter with how anything like this has been done in the past, that it's power grab, that it's the politicisation of the Electoral Commission, and then once you tie that in with the sort of regulation of politics, MPs, second jobs, that kind of thing, the government are immediately on the back foot. So I just want to, by way of I suppose positivity, say that I am actually more positive now than I've been at any point that we will get some concessions in this bill. So it is worth lobbying your Conservative MP if you've got one, because I suspect they're feeling under pressure, and I think the most persuasive thing to do is to tie it into the sort of narrative that's playing out at the moment around basically integrity in public life.
Thanks, Kat. Nick, have you got anything you'd like to add?
I mean, only a small thing, really. I mean, I totally agree with what Helen and Kat were saying. I mean, I think that some work needs to be done on trying to identify the peers who we can try to influence, because clearly there are going to have to be some who are not the kind of usual suspects that we're going to have to win over, you know. And I think that, like Helen said, you know, we're not going to overturn the bill, but hopefully we can make some changes and we can limit some damage. I mean, what I probably would say, I mean, partly it's about trying to both identifying the peers that we need to engage with, but then identifying the organisations who have influence over those particular peers, particularly the kind of crossbench or some of the kind of Tories who are going to be unhappy about this. I mean, and I think there will be some. Just following on from what Kat said, I mean, it's interesting that some of the Tory press have been quite outspoken on this bill and the wider issue about democracy. So I think that there is a mood that we can tap into. So I mean, I think once we identify the peers that we need to engage and to win over, then we can identify the organisations that are best suited to engage with those people. I think that clearly at the moment we've not got a broad enough alliance, or we've not got enough input from the third sector especially, and we need to, and there might be some space for people to kind of lobby or push if they're involved in other organisations, which can then potentially influence those crossbenchers or those Tories who could be won over. But I mean, I think that time is short. I know there has been a slight delay, but things are going to move quite quickly once they get going in the House of Lords, and we obviously need to get to those peers directly.
Okay, great. Thanks, Nick. Kat, it was really good to hear you talk about being optimistic, because certainly I haven't been from listening to some of the things that are coming down the road for us in this bill. So we've got one question in which says, which bits of the bill are you confident can be altered?
I'd say confidence is a very strong word, just to bring it all back down again. I mean, there was the only kind of movement I got at committee stage was when I pushed on. This is really dry, I'm afraid, but basically you have to apply for a postal vote on paper. You can't do it digitally, and that was something I pushed, and the minister's going to go away and look at. So, I mean, that is the limit of what we managed to get out of the committee. But I do think that the political narrative has completely changed, because we finished in Bill Committee about 3 weeks ago, I think it is now. So obviously in the last couple of weeks, I think the political narrative has completely changed. I meant to mention earlier, because I'm thinking about what's persuasive to Conservatives, because that's clearly where the pressure needs to be put. The voter ID side of the bill, which isn't the most horrible part of the bill, but it is pretty bad. There were trials done in local authority areas where there was an individual who challenged it legally about whether or not the trials were legal. Now, the government is still facing a legal challenge in the Supreme Court over the legality of the rollout of the voter ID pilots, which happened in 2019. The case is expected to be heard between January and April next year, but obviously the government are planning to have got this bill through by then. So it might be a persuasive argument to Conservatives that it would be wrong for them to legislate before a challenge had been heard in the Supreme Court. It might be that makes some of them nervous. I just thought I'd throw that in.
Brilliant, thanks. Nick, what areas of the bill do you think can be focused on to change?
Well, I mean, there are various kind of rumours, I don't know how true they are or not, but that the government might give some ground on the voter ID element of it, which, while that will be welcome, we also know from what's been said today and reading the bill that isn't the kind of worst part of it, and that there's a danger that people accept that as a win, whereas the government always intended to give some ground on that so they can keep other points. I mean, clearly, I think that one of the areas we need to go hard on, and I think there's some potential in the House of Lords, is the role of the Electoral Commission, and particularly with what's happened with all the lobbying stuff and the Patterson stuff and everything, the idea that the government basically remove the body that gives an oversight, while that's only one part of this bill. I do think that's probably going to, in the current context, that should be a strong one for us. And I think there will be some people who we can win over for that. I mean, obviously, there's more pernicious elements of the bill, which obviously that's what the Tories want to bring through, issues around joint campaigning and stuff, which I think is going to be harder, but obviously that's going to be the ultimate goal, to either get greater clarity. Because I think one of the problems of this bill and many other bills that we're seeing going forward at the moment is that there is an ambiguity, deliberate ambiguity in them, and it gives power down the road to the Secretary of State to interpret, which means that, you know, we fear the worst, and we're probably right, but to a layperson looking at this bill, it might not look potentially bad. But, you know, if we think that Michael Gove is going to be the one interpreting the rules after, you know, that should send a shudder down most people's spines, really.
Helen, coming to you and also wrapping up into one of the questions that was asked as well, how will the bill affect the Tories? And is there any chance that we can maybe just talk about this bill in terms of Tory sleaze and wrap that up into a campaign that might spark people's attention in a way that maybe we've been struggling to so far?
I think that bringing these issues together is going to be critical, and I was also heartened by what Kat said about feeling more positive, but I think it's really true, isn't it, that the narrative around this has changed, and I think people are, and hopefully legislators will be much less prepared to sort of cross some of those lines of what we think are the norms of decent behaviour in the light of what has happened recently. And I think in the light of these things being front page issues and there being more scrutiny on them, to be honest with you. And I think that in terms of the sort of parts of the bill that we might be able to change, I think I strongly agree with Nick that that issue around ministerial control and independence of the Electoral Commission is something that we really can focus on, and I think we'll be able to make some positive inroads on with people who are like outside the Labour benches in the Lords. And I think that, as somebody asked the question, should we not be working cross-party, and I think that's what we absolutely have to do, and to make the argument that this isn't about us in the Labour movement pleading for special allowances so that we can do our campaigning. This is about us saying that actually this needs to be fair, and it needs to be done in a way that isn't partisan and that doesn't give any particular party a particular advantage. And I think there are some very strong arguments specifically against the ministerial oversight that I think will resonate really clearly. And I think there are lots of bad things in this bill, but those bad things are made so much worse by not having a fair and impartial adjudicator in the shape of the Electoral Commission, because that ambiguity that Nick referred to, that some of these things are not defined, and that if you define joint campaigning one way, actually it's that bit might not be that problematic in that way, and you could sort of say, oh, it would be tricky there, but it would be fair. Or you give it to the government to decide, and suddenly whole swathes of things that we would never recognise as joint campaigning are suddenly on the list because they're playing political games with it. And the difference between rules that I think are intrinsically unfair being adjudicated by the government versus by a fair external arbitrator, I think are really quite different things. So I think changing that is really, really important, and making the case. And exactly as the questioner said, I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the person who raised it, but wrapping it up with what has been going on in the last few weeks, and sort of saying that actually having impartial, fair arbitrators of what is and what isn't acceptable behaviour in politics and in political campaigning is really important to stop sleaze and the future sort of accumulation of all of these things that we know will happen if one party gets to set the rules of the game. I think it is critical. So building up the momentum from where we are now, and really focusing on the probably relatively specific number of things that we are going to be able to get mitigations on in the Lords, I think is where we're at.
Can I just jump back in, Hazel? Sorry.
Of course you can, Nick. Yeah.
What I'd also want to say, and maybe I'm being a little bit controversial here, but hey,
great, we don't have a debate about that.
No, but I do worry in some of the coalition that exists at the moment is that there is a feeling, and I understand why they're coming from that position, there is a feeling that we can't really do anything. So what we need to do, this is an opportunity to present a kind of pure, ideal, alternative bill. What does democracy look like? And, a lot of people clearly, the state of democracy in the UK is poor and it needs changing and everything. But I worry that some people are putting their energies into having a different conversation to this bill, and whether it's about PR, whether it's about all sorts of kind of participatory democracy, etc. Well, that's all great, but that steers people away from the fight that we've got to have on this bill, because I do think that we can make some wins. We can mitigate some of the worst elements to it. I don't think we're gonna get the whole bill out, but I do think that we have to be realistic. That not only realistic, but this is a fight that we have to have, and we can't be idealists about what our democracy is and just use this as an excuse to punt a purer form of democracy, because no one's going to listen to that. And in the meantime, all these changes are going to come through. We have to be focused on the bill as it stands at the moment and trying to do what we can to limit it and mitigate the kind of worst excesses of it.
Brilliant. Kind of leading on from that, we've got a question, it's more like a comment really, about whether or not we can get like a briefing sheet that's going to cover all of these points after tonight's meeting, so that people can spread that conversation and educate other people about it, because we are going to have to form a coalition, and I do think, like Nick said, there is a bit of a moment. So what would be the best way to do that? I'll go over to Helen for that one.
Yeah, we'd be really happy to help with that. We have got quite an accessible blog that we have written that goes through a number of the issues with the bill. Obviously not literally everything in it, because as we've talked about, there's loads of stuff in there, but talks specifically around the voter ID, the marking their own homework, and the effect on third-party campaigning through looking at it from the perspective of trade unions. But as Nick has said, it's a wider issue than that. I think it sets it out quite clearly and it's quite shareable. I think we can find a way to share that link with everybody who's been on the call tonight in the next day or so. We've also got a more detailed technical briefing about the trade union third-party campaigner issue, which I'd be very happy for us to find a way to share with colleagues who've been on the call as well. And I think it is about us in the next couple of weeks, really, getting our lines and our comms really solid on this, so that we are building on where the debate is in the country at the moment, and linking this bill in with that, and in order that we can get as much of the damage removed as we possibly can as the bill moves into the Lords.
Brilliant. There was another question about whether or not the recording for tonight's meeting will be available, which I'm sure it is. That was hopefully the purpose of the recording, and we can send both out with the blog. So just before we bring the meeting to a close, Kat, you will struggle to believe this, despite saying earlier that you were, a positive person, but someone's having trouble getting any replies back from their Tory MP, Philip Holloway. What can they do about it?
Obviously, MPs are not. You don't have to have a reply. MPs are not obliged to reply to you, and I guess it's frustrating that there's nothing you can do to obligate them to reply. But I mean, you can shame them, and I think it is about maybe writing a letter in the local paper, because you can bet your bottom dollar Philip Holloway picks up the local paper.
Brilliant. Okay.
Can I just come in, Hazel? Something Kat said sparked a memory with me, which is that we've got a really good tool online on the website, actually, where you can there's suggestions for text that you can send a model letter to your local paper about this issue as well, because I do think finding ways to get that solid comms out into the world to other activists and to campaigners locally is really important. So if you check out the Labour Union's website, and Robbie has helpfully sent me the link of the blog, which is labourunions.org.uk/electionsbill. There's a few different actions that you can do on there to do with the bill, but also it'll put you on our mailing list. So over the next weeks and months, you'll get our regular updates about the campaigning as well.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to thank all of our panelists today. So I think the most important message is that we shouldn't be defeatist about this bill. It has wide-ranging implications for the Labour movement and for our democracy. And hopefully, if you follow the links that will be posted out at the end of the meeting, you can find out different ways to get more involved and to kind of tool yourself up on the main repercussions of this. And hopefully we can try and do our best to stop the Tory sleaze. There's quite a lot of it, but in specific in and around this bill. So thank you everyone, have a lovely evening, and getting more involved in both your unions and in the Labour Party and in organisations that do great work like Hope Not Hate. Good night.